You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Caitlyn.
This is episode 286 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. So to start off on the show, I want to go over some recent developments in the Mueller probe and, the whole Russiagate conspiracy, along with this Maria Butina, I think is her name, this Russian woman who was a kind of lobbyist, I believe, for the NRA or for gun rights in the United States, and, what her whole trial means, because this hasn't necessarily been rolled into the Russiagate narrative, with the general conclusion that, Russia colluded with Donald Trump in order to sway the 2016 election in favor of Trump over Hillary Clinton, who otherwise would have won the election. However, it does go along with this general narrative presented by, the never Trumpers and most of the mainstream media that Russia is this malign actor in the United States, and it's somebody who's constantly trying to, I think, undermine the integrity of U.S. politics. So for all those reasons, really important stuff here, plus the nuclear weapons. Always gotta, talk about that. And foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. Check out libertarianinstitute.org to find all my work, daily news roundups there. The podcast is there, both on the homepage. If I produce other work, it typically ends up somewhere on that site. And then for the little bit of extra bonus content that I produce, check out patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so here in the Mueller probe stuff, it's kind of hard to say exactly, I guess, what the big news is. There's all these claims, I guess, that they're really moving in on Trump. I don't know how many times I've read the same headline over again, is that, blank event proves, Mueller is really moving in on Trump now. I mean, this has been constant over the last 2 years. And, more than once, it's like whatever going on with Michael Flynn or Cohen or any of these other people. So here's the thing. The Russiagate conspiracy is that Russia colluded with Donald Trump in order to sway the 2016 election. Now, I think is probably growing evidence that Donald Trump at some point in his life was either guilty of some tax crimes or possibly some campaign finance stuff. Not involving Vladimir Putin sending $500,000 to Donald Trump as a bribe or donating to his campaign, but rather the potential that hush money payments paid by the Trump campaign to Stormy Daniels and potentially other women, I believe, would violate campaign finance laws. Now, I don't know what we're going to do with this. And, this is getting into kind of the area here where campaign finance laws are really ridiculous. I know a few people in politics and, prior to even this Trump thing, they had always talked to me about how, as much as everybody tries to stay in compliance with the law, everybody's always breaking it. And you hear stories about how, some guy made some robocalls and ended up getting fined millions of dollars or something like that. And these things do happen. And so with the, I guess, vast number and, different meanings and different ways of reading all these different election regulations, it's possible. I think that Donald Trump did, maybe break one of those. And so does that delegitimize his presidency? I don't know. I'm sure if you looked, hard enough, Hillary Clinton violated quite a few of those as well. And, my guess is that if you want to play that game, it's kind of like the situation with foreign governments paying people in the United States and not registering as foreign lobbyists. Look at Michael Flynn. Everybody does it, but nobody, is getting punished for it. However, people start getting, punished for it, then a lot of other people should as well. But, this in no way backs up any of the Russiagate claims. There's a fantastic interview Scott Horton and Peter Van Buren pretty recently on the Scott Horton Show. I'll link to in the show notes page. But I'm sure all of you have it somewhere in your podcast feeds if you haven't listened to it already. So just, switch over, check that out, and listen to that after you're done with this show. Again, the only, I think, foreign influence that's been proven as far as this Trump campaign goes is after Trump became the president-elect, Israel pushed Trump to have Flynn lobby Russia to veto a UN Security Council resolution that I don't know if to say condemn Israel would have been right, but would have basically just kind of been favorable to the Palestinians. This particular resolution, the Obama administration was prepared to abstain from it and let this come to a vote, in which case it would pass. The UN having the power to veto a resolution. So Israel lobbied the Flynn and the Trump administration to do that. Russia didn't go for it anyways, and the thing passed. Didn't really change anything. It's not like suddenly the Palestinians have the upper hand on the Israelis, and that's the way that conflict's going there. The Palestinians are still the oppressed people. But, continue to remember that every time you see these claims that Trump's guilty, that doesn't mean that Trump is necessarily guilty, including with Russia. It's possible that he's guilty of other things. And this isn't to say, I guess either that, Russia didn't do anything in the 2016 election. I mean, I think it's certainly possible, that somewhere somebody in the Russian government, took a couple $100,000 and paid, some people to run fake Facebook ads. However, when we've actually looked at the content of those ads, they're not even unanimously favorable towards Donald Trump and against Hillary Clinton. Some are pro-Bernie, some are pro-Trump, some are even pro-Hillary. And so with the research, very good research and analysis by Gareth Porter, actually looking at the total number of ads that could have possibly been linked to Russian accounts and just looking at how small they are, there's really no influence in the U.S. election from these fake accounts. And so from what it seems to me, that, the people of America should be happy. We didn't have a system that the Russians could interrupt. And it turned out that, the people voted for Donald Trump, and not even a majority, but, whatever he ends up getting in the electoral college is enough to make him president of the United States. And, that's the way the election went without Russian influence. If anybody has any specific claims of Russiagate that they're either having trouble debunking or, want me to go over on the show, because, I've literally been talking about this the entire course of the show. If you go back, probably the first 5 episodes, you're going to find. In fact, I think episode 4 of the show is about Flynn getting, fired by Trump, for some of this, early Russiagate stuff that I'm sure most of my listeners actually, cause, that show has only a couple hundred downloads or whatever, have heard this, that stuff. So if you want to know about, message, probably the Facebook group's still the best place. Foreign Policy Focus is a private Facebook group. I do a private just to make sure there's no super obnoxious people that get in there or whatever. And you could ask the question and maybe I'll even answer it on the show. All right. I think her name's Maria Butina. At least that's the way it looks on paper. Sorry. I probably should watch more TV news to actually get these names right sometimes. But she's this Russian woman who was, I believe, working as an agent of the Russian government and acting as a U.S. gun lobbyist. Now, the portrayal is that she's a Russian spy looking to, I think, influence or I think the kind of the new popular phrase is sow discord, whatever this means, I guess, push the importance of hot button issues. Although, it's not like they need to. The reason they're hot button issues are because they're issues that like Americans fundamentally care about, right? Like, for example, conservatives believe life begins in consumption. That's not a Russian plot. That's, their deep seated, kind of a human or religious beliefs. And that's what they think about like the world. And, where life begins is a difficult question to answer. And, the liberals say that, you should, it's a woman's body. And so, if it is this is just a woman's body issue, and then, casting any kind of limit on it is, basically subjecting it and lowering the value of women. And that's why both sides feel so strongly. It's not that the Russians are sowing discord. It's that, there's 300 million people that are trying to decide, which way to live. And in each case, the opposite is morally disgusting to them. And so, I think this is the reason you have all this discord, and it's not because of Russia doing anything. But, here's some interesting facts about the case, I guess, is that it seems more or less that she's generally guilty, right? That she is a Russian agent acting in the United States and, attempting to influence people to a certain position. Although it does seem like this is a position that she does ideologically hold. And also, she's not being paid or she's not working for the GRU. She's working for somebody, I believe, in the Treasury, a high-ranking member of the Russian Treasury Department, who is also, I believe, ideologically a gun rights activist. And so not that that necessarily means that it's not, Russian trying to, play any role in the United States, but those are certainly factors to look at, important information to know. Now, there's a great article in Bloomberg, and I'll link to it in the show notes page. It's an opinion piece that explains that how this case is played out, it hasn't played out like a spy case. It's not like she was looking to, sleep with the right senator so she could get a peek at top secret documents or something like that. And in fact, early reports pretty heavily slandered this woman, saying that she was basically trading sets for influence. But that claim has since been dropped, and she's not accused of doing that any longer, which, you would think is a pretty serious and, would be an issue for a lot of people, that, the government just slandered this woman as somebody who was, basically prostituting herself for the Russian government. And in fact, she wasn't. But in the way this hasn't played out like a spy case, this woman has talked. She's pleaded guilty. She's not being extradited or, traded back to Russia in any way. I believe she's planning to return to Russia, after her, sentence, whatever it is up. But, the Russian government as a whole has seemed kind of ill-concerned about her. And so all these signs kind of, point to the fact that she doesn't seem to be somebody who was involved in anything super top secret or super concerning to either side. And that this is more just a case of, did she violate the law of being a Russian agent, trying to cast or portray influence in the United States, make connections and network. The writer says that at one point they were, I guess, in the USSR, and that there is this kind of common practice that goes on between the United States and Russia, where we essentially have agents in each other's countries, but they're really not doing anything, and they're more just like making connections. And it's, I think, more so a way so that if information needs to be passed, the connections exist, the networking exists, for those kind of things to happen. So again, here's the important thing. This isn't about election influence. This isn't about Russia trying to change U.S. laws. It's just, a woman who was a Russian agent in the United States. She wasn't a top secret spy. This isn't any way showing Russia's terrible malign influence in the United States, and doesn't even compare to the kind of things that the United States does to influence in other countries, like spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in Hungary, propping up certain media outlets. All right, so I want to talk about this article. I read it on antiwar.com, I believe. It's by Curt Mills, and I'll link to it in the show notes page. And I want to tie it into something that Scott Horton typically says, and that is, if people knew the first thing about the situation in Israel regarding who's, the oppressors and who are the victims, then they would instantly side with the Palestinians. And kind of what Curt points out in his piece here is just how quickly foreign policy consensus can change. And I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that kind of what Scott Horton says is right, is that people just don't have the first clue about this thing, that they don't really understand who the real victims are and who the real oppressed are. And that's probably because, to move into a piece by another great person that I would like to follow in foreign policy issues, Caitlyn Johnstone, it's all about narrative setting for the mainstream actors. They create this narrative that, anti-Semitism is, the prevailing evil. And for that reason, the Muslims hate the Jews and they want to kill them. And that's the basis for the conflict in Israel and Palestine. And no matter what Israel does, Palestinians will walk into, Jewish areas and, blow themselves up. This is the narrative, that Israel can't do anything but just try to defend itself. And I do think there's probably some understanding that this isn't done in the least restrictive way possible, but by the time people get done with the first part of the narrative, they're just, all focus on, well, kill the damn terrorist. And, that's who the Palestinians are portrayed to be. And so now when you come to situations like I would say the U.S. war in Yemen, Libya, Somalia, mostly in Syria, but, people know a little bit more there. People really don't know the first thing, which is where these places are on the map and to just name the warring parties. At least in like Israel, they know it's like Muslim and Jewish, or Israeli and Palestine. I guess they would think kind of like white and Arab. But in Yemen, they don't know who the warring parties are. In Libya, no idea. Somalia, they may think it's a war against Al-Qaeda, but it's really not. And so I think that's why, this foreign policy consensus could change so quickly. So in the Yemen situation here, you had this going along, and there's grassroots, efforts over the first 3.5 years of this war to really explain to people, hey, what's going on here is horrific. However, the media narrative that's said not very frequently, I mean, MSNBC really doesn't cover this war, but if anybody gets the narrative, it's that the Iranian-backed rebels in the country are fighting a terrorist war against Saudi Arabia and the government there. And so that's all people know. They don't know they don't know where Yemen is on the map. They don't know who the Houthis are. They don't know, the history of Yemen, who the dictator is, why he ended up, teaming up with the Houthis, and how that all unfolded and played out, over the past almost 4 years now, that the war has turned into a genocide. It's a war where food and infrastructure, like medical facilities, have been intentionally targeted. And when people learn those things, I think they pretty much instantly, get the right part of that position. So, the Yemen war is going along. Nobody really knows anything. And then you have this big event, which isn't even in Yemen. It's a Khashoggi murder, right? This guy works for the Washington Post. He's murdered in Turkey, pretty obviously by the Saudis, most probably, by the Crown Prince, who happens to also be somebody who gets along well with Trump's son-in-law. And so now you have this very clear anti-Trump angle. Trump, has since doubled down and really made it possible for the mainstream media to really smear him with the crimes of Mohammed bin Salman. And suddenly, people now know one of the first things, which is that the Saudis aren't moral actors in the Middle East, and that maybe they're doing bad things. And so then they look at Yemen, and the Saudis are saying, we're just doing the best we can to kill the terrorists. And then you could show them a video of a school bus being blown up and the Saudis saying it was a legitimate target. And people go, oh, okay. I think the narrative has been broken, and just like that, you teach them the first thing, and suddenly you have the Senate voting on a war powers resolution. Now, I did see some clarification in an interview. Scott Horton, I believe Reese Erlich, I'll link to this interview on the show notes page as well, explaining that this war powers resolution will need to get, I guess, super majority, 66 votes in the Senate and whatever 2/3 of the House is, because the president can veto this bill. It doesn't look like it's going to be taken up in the House under the current Republican leadership, but the incoming Democrats could do this. I don't know if 66 votes is still a pretty big margin, but it may be doable. And so, I think we're all going to have some opportunities in the coming days to meet with relatives and families and stuff. And rather than be combative about it, just try to, teach people the first thing, and I know some of these topics aren't easy to talk about at Christmas, but, maybe gently try to say, rather than combatively, just teach people the first thing about Syria or Yemen or Libya or Somalia. All right. I want to update some other things on Yemen before I move on here. We had the agreement for the ceasefire in Sweden that got delayed a couple days. Fighting goes on, some people dies, but now it's looking like that ceasefire has taken place. As of the morning I'm recording this show, at least. Now, by the time 2 days go by and most of you have heard this show, maybe that all changes. But I've seen a lot of optimism about this, and so it's good to see. The bad news in Yemen, of course, is that the situation on the ground is bad and getting worse. And that, it's not necessarily we need a ceasefire for this one port city to turn the humanitarian crisis around. It'll help. It's a great thing if we have a ceasefire for Hadeda. But at the end of the day, what needs to happen in Yemen is for this conflict, to be resolved and for the air war to end. That way infrastructure could start to be repaired. We're looking at 3,000 people died in November. I guess the bloodiest month that this war has been tracked. So, really a terrible situation there. And only going to get worse until the United States withdraws their support. All right. Something I saw on the Intercept, actually. So there's this, I guess, Palestinian woman in Texas. She's a speech language pathologist who contracts with Texas public schools to provide services to kids or do evaluations. She points out in the video that she has a unique skill in that she's a fluent Arabic speaker. And so, this opens her up to being able to, evaluate or work with a group of minority children, but, children who speak Arabic. And this is, I'm sure, in some cases, very helpful. Anyways, she got her new contract and she noticed an interesting clause in it saying that by signing the contract, you are agreeing not to support the boycott of Israel. And so now this woman, who, if she went and lived in Israel, would become a second-class citizen. If she went to Gaza, she would be, one of the people trapped inside the prison camp there, fired at just for approaching kind of the border crossing or the wall of the prison fence, whatever you want to call it. And, she went and lived in the West Bank. She would risk having some, Israeli tank run over her home or some Israeli settlers just moved in and take her property. And so it's absolutely ridiculous that we have laws like this in the United States that would allow that or actually enforce this. You know what I mean? This is a real problem. And I know there's bills in the Senate and stuff like that trying to bring this to a national level where it would almost, legislate the position on Israel versus Palestine. Nick Turse wrote an article that I'll link to in the show notes page on the situation in Africa. The U.S. has 30 named missions in Africa in the past 3 years. The continent continues to be absolutely, chaotic in a lot of places. You have this Ebola outbreak right now in the Congo reaching some pretty dangerous positions. We now have 30 confirmed cases and 15 confirmed deaths of Ebola in this city of 1 million people. So, really worried about massive outbreak. Now, I do think they were able to get ahead of this a little bit and vaccinate a lot of the healthcare workers in the area. The problem is there's fighting going on in this area, right? And so this just creates a situation where the worst possible things are in place, right? The militants are in charge, and so they're probably not listening to doctors and healthcare workers quite as much as, as democratically elected and non-military personnel could be terrible leaders. I think it's probably more likely that they're going to listen to medical personnel and then, claim, credit for, stemming the Ebola crisis or whatever it is. And so you also have the fact that, with war, there's kidnappings and, very messy situations, as far as blood goes and, it just not the combination you want to team up with it in Ebola. Very dangerous. The war in Somalia is raging on there. You had this case where a former Al-Shabaab high-ranking guy, they called him a number 2, but I don't know how accurate that is, defected, I guess, and, said he's no longer affiliated with Al-Shabaab. He was running for a regional president's position, and I think this would have given him some kind of legitimacy of kind of being the controller of the Al-Shabaab controlled region of Somalia, which is most of southern Somalia there. And this guy's arrested by Ethiopian and Somali soldiers. This causes a pretty big outcry, it seemed to me, for the people of Somalia. There's protests. I think 8 protesters were killed in the things. We've seen an increase in U.S. strikes over the past couple of days. 70 plus the U.S. claims to kill of Al-Shabaab militants, 8 in one strike and 62 in another. It'll be interesting to see, I guess, as time rolls forward, what, stories come out of Somalia actually, and if any of the people killed here were civilians, and who if the targets were actual Al-Shabaab militants, if they were kind of different groups or protesters. Certainly, I doubt all these guys were, Osama bin Laden types, and this isn't the United States fighting the terror war, which is where Trump gets the authorization to drop these bombs. All right, here, I'm going to wrap up the show, but I did want to mention that a White House official, unnamed White House official, but a White House official said that Donald Trump did not discuss with Erdogan at the G20 summit if the U.S. would extradite, or I guess Trump didn't agree to extradite Gulen at a G20 meeting with Erdogan. So that's not quite the narrative the Turkish government put out, saying that Trump said he was working on it. Now, in between the two statements, I guess there could be some truth where Trump is actually working to extradite Gulen, but doesn't really plan to. But Turkey, the statement they put out certainly seemed to think that they were going to get that guy. So it's interesting that story has come up so many times under the Trump presidency. And it seems like the foreign policy consensus, that establishment voice would be, this absolutely isn't going to happen, and is off the table, just like recognizing that Crimea is now a part of Russia. But, who knows, maybe Donald Trump is, just going to go ahead and extradite Gulen, throw him under the bus in order to keep the U.S. military outpost in Syria or something crazy like that. All right, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. Immersionnews.com is my news website. Check that out. It's up and running and doing great. Immersion News is the name I use on the social media network minds.com. I love the thing. Check it out. Patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Twitter @KYAAALE. Facebook is Libertarian Union.